don't think people understand that a story like Kenobi has never been done before, and it really has the chance to open a lot of doors for storytelling. You're probably thinking, what the hell are you talking about, Goldman? We've seen plenty of characters in plenty of different mediums get their own shows or movies. This is true, especially with the Marvel and DC films nowadays. But what's interesting about Kenobi that not many people realize has never really been done before is adding a new chapter in the middle of a character's story. Let me elaborate. This cinematic universe type of storytelling is still relatively modern in the history of cinema. If you look at storytelling 50 years ago, you didn't often see movies that had sequels. Sure, there were a few exceptions, but it wasn't really until Star Wars, I would argue, that trilogies and other types of sequels became popular. And then flash forward about 30 years, it was the MCU that really introduced a cinematic universe, where you have stories that take place in the same universe but aren't necessarily sequels to what came before. Like, the first Thor movie is not a sequel to Iron Man 1, even though it takes place later in the chronology. Star Wars has always been about trilogies, and it really wasn't until when Disney bought the franchise where they started treating it like a cinematic universe. But even up until this point, Star Wars has pretty much always been about one of three different types of stories: the introduction of new characters, the backstory to those characters, or a continuation of the story of those characters. What I mean by this is that obviously stories will introduce new characters, but Star Wars, after that initial set of stories, will either go fill in the chapters prior to that story, aka prequels, or chapters with those characters after the original story, hence the sequels. Like with Anakin, we got the story of Darth Vader in the originals, and then the prequels filled out what happened before all that. With Luke, we got his story in the originals, and then we moved forward 30 years to the sequels, which fleshed out his story after the originals. What Star Wars hasn't done before, outside of the expanded universe novels, is introduce a major chapter of a character's story in the middle of their story. We already know the beginning of Obi Wan's story, and we know the end. It's pretty much a complete story. But what the Kenobi show is doing is introducing a new chapter in the middle of his story, and this is a chapter that's gonna have a lot of consequences on his life. As I stated before, the originals gave us the ending to Anakin's story, and the job of the prequels was to give us the beginning. The originals also gave us the beginning of Luke's story, and the job of the sequels is to give us the ending of that story. We have a complete story for Obi Wan, and the job of the Obi Wan Kenobi series is not to give us the beginning or end of his story, but give us a new story that's smack right in the middle. I can't off the top of my head think of a story like that that has been told on this large of a scale. The closest I could think of would be the Black Widow movie. We got the beginning and end of her story up until Endgame, and then the Black Widow movie decided to tell a new story that took place in the middle of all of that. The reason that's kind of different from Obi-Wan's story is that Black Widow was an important character, but she was never as important to the MCU as Obi-Wan was to Star Wars. Also, I'm sure when Captain America Civil War was written and when Infinity War and Endgame were written, they knew they would tell the story of the Black Widow movie. So it's not like they decided to add a new chapter in the middle of her story, they just decided to tell her story out of order. With Obi-Wan, when George Lucas wrote the prequels, he had no incentive to create a show that would take place between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. That's why Obi-Wan's story is already a complete story. You could look up videos from fellow video essay YouTubers of how to write a sequel or how to write a prequel, but there aren't any videos on how to write a pre-sequel? Is that what I should call it? Because it's still a prequel to the originals, but it's also a sequel to the prequels. So I guess I'll call it a pre-sequel or a C-prequel? Let me know in the comments what Kenobi should be called, because this is hilarious. I guess you could also argue that the Clone Wars is akin to Anakin. The Clone Wars does introduce new elements to Anakin's story and Obi-Wan's story that weren't there in the prequels and the originals, especially Anakin's relationship to Ahsoka and Obi-Wan's relationship to Satine. But Anakin and Obi-Wan aren't the main characters of the Clone Wars. They're just one of many prominent ones. I guarantee you that in the Kenobi series, we will learn more about Anakin and Obi-Wan than what we learned about them in the Clone Wars. I'm curious to see how the writers will handle a story that's a pre-sequel. Man, only 2.5 more months. If you want to see more prequel content, then check out this video where I talk about what I think is the best scene in Revenge of the Sith. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.